Inside Alcatraz Prison, world's deadliest inmates and gang secrets exposed. Subscribe now if you dare, because once you enter Alcatraz, there is no way back. The night fog rolled in heavy across San Francisco Bay, the kind that swallowed sound and blurred the skyline into a dim outline of trembling light. On the water, the current churned restless under the pull of the tide. And in the heart of that dark, churning sea sat a jagged fortress of concrete and steel, Alcatraz, the Rock. For decades, it had been the last stop for the most dangerous men in America. To be sent here was to vanish behind stone and iron, to disappear into the myth of a place built to break even the most hardened criminals. But on this particular night in June of 1962, the Rock was trembling. Guards pacing the tiers noticed something wrong in one of the narrow cells. A prison officer pushed his flashlight through the bars, expecting to find an inmate curled in restless sleep. Instead, the beam lit a crude papier-mâché head, eyes painted wide open, hair stolen from the barber shop glued onto its skull. And behind it, the bed was empty. The man it was meant to represent, Frank Morris, career criminal, escape artist, and genius of quiet rebellion, was gone. The alarm bells thundered seconds later, reverberating through the concrete blocks and steel doors, waking men from their bunks with a sound like the roar of warplanes. Guards rushed in formation, rifles in hand, boots pounding the tier, whistles cutting the night. Inmates rose from their bunks, some shouting, some laughing, some terrified, for even in Alcatraz, a place where hope was meant to die, the impossible had just been attempted. 3 men, all high-risk prisoners, had vanished from their locked cells under the eyes of watchtowers, bars, and guards. In a place the government swore no one could escape, in a prison that had defeated the likes of Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly, something had been breached. As sirens blared and the island locked down, searchlights scoured the water, slicing through fog and spray. Boats of the Coast Guard spun in circles, their engines roaring against the tide, crews squinting into darkness that swallowed everything. No bodies floated. No cries for help carried across the wave. Just silence and the water's endless pull out to sea. This was the beginning of one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. But to understand how 3 men dared to take on the impossible, you have to step inside the Rock itself, to walk the tiers where the cold never leaves your bones, to hear the clang of steel doors that echoed like death sentences, and to feel the weight of a place designed not just to punish but to erase. Alcatraz was never just a prison. It was a statement. Built on a rocky outcrop in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by icy currents, it promised no chance of escape. Federal officials designed it for the men who had made other prisons tremble, gangsters, killers, masterminds who thrived on chaos. Here they would be silenced, cut off from the world, watched every minute, stripped of power. For the government, Alcatraz was the answer to the crime wave that defined Prohibition and the Depression era. For the inmates, it was hell on the water. Frank Morris, the man whose empty cell triggered the alarms, was no ordinary prisoner. Born into poverty, raised in institutions more than homes, Morris grew up learning that rules were obstacles, walls were challenges, and authority was an enemy to outsmart. His criminal record read like a grim resume: burglary, armed robbery, escape from state prisons. Each time, bars bent to his will, fences became ladders, and locks seemed made for his hands. When he was finally sent to Alcatraz in 1960, the Bureau of Prisons thought it had solved its Morris problem. On the Rock, no one could outthink the system. But Morris was not alone. 2 brothers, Clarence and John Anglin, had also found themselves behind Alcatraz's steel bars. Born in Georgia, raised as farm boys in Florida, the Anglins had grown into professional thieves. They specialized in bank robberies, quick getaways, and clever disguises. But like Morris, their skill was not in violence, but in slipping through the cracks. They had broken out of jails before, and when they met Morris on the island, a spark of possibility ignited. The last man was Allen West, a car thief from New York with a reputation for toughness. He was older, less polished than the others, but he shared the same hunger for freedom, and the same hatred for confinement. Together, the four became conspirators in the most audacious escape attempt Alcatraz had ever faced. Life inside the prison hardened their resolve. Alcatraz was designed to crush. The cell blocks were damp and cold, the walls sweating salt air from the bay. In winter, winds howled through broken panes, turning the place into a refrigerated tomb. Every sound echoed, the rattle of chains, the bark of orders, the cough of sick men. Silence was enforced. Inmates could go days without speaking. Each movement was timed, each privilege conditional. Inmates worked in the laundry, the factory, or the kitchens, never alone, never unwatched. Yet even in this world of total control, the cracks existed. Morris noticed how the ventilation grills near the back of their cells seemed corroded, the metal thinned by years of dampness. He tested them, quietly, scraping with spoons smuggled from the mess hall. The metal flaked, and a hole began to appear. It was the beginning of something unthinkable, a tunnel out of the rock. Night after night, as guards patrolled with flashlights and keys, Morris and the Anglins chipped away at concrete, muffling the sound with the roar of accordions played during the prison's approved music hours. They worked in silence, hiding their tools behind bookshelves, covering holes with cardboard painted to match the walls. It was meticulous, patient work, the kind that demanded months of planning. And all the while, the ocean outside reminded them of what failure meant. Icy water, currents pulling out to the Pacific, bodies swallowed without trace. But freedom, even at that price, was worth the gamble. By early June of 1962, the men had built not just holes but a hidden workshop in the utility corridor behind their cells. There, under flickering light and stale air, they pieced together a raft from stolen raincoats and glue, tested by inflating it under blankets. They made paddles from scrap wood. They sculpted dummy heads with soap, toilet paper, and hair swept from the barbershop floor. The plan was as insane as it was brilliant. While guards counted papier-mâché heads on their pillows, the real men would crawl through holes, climb pipes, scale the roof, and vanish into the night. The night of the escape, Allen West faltered. His vent was clogged with concrete, and he could not break through in time. The others left him behind, climbing into the dark with only their homemade gear and desperation. By morning, their cells looked undisturbed, until the guard's flashlight caught the painted faces staring blankly into the night. The island erupted in chaos. Helicopters swept the bay, boats crisscrossed in frantic grids, FBI agents arrived to take over the investigation. The prison warden announced confidently to the press, no one had made it out alive. The water was too cold, the currents too strong, the odds too steep. To the official line, the men had drowned, their bodies lost to the Pacific. Case closed. But no bodies were ever found. No paddles washed ashore. No raft was discovered in the tide. What the authorities had was absence, and absence is the most dangerous clue of all. Over the decades, rumors multiplied. A stolen car reported near the Marin headlands the morning after. Unconfirmed sightings of the Anglin brothers in Brazil, decades later, blending into communities of expatriates. A photograph surfaced in the 1970s, grainy and unclear, showing two men on a farm in South America who looked strikingly like the missing convict. The FBI labeled it speculative, but whispers never died. And in the prison itself, something darker lingered. Guards spoke of hidden allies among the inmates who had supplied tools or kept watch. Some whispered of a prison worker bribed into silence. And others wondered if the escape had been more than desperation, if it had been a test of Alcatraz itself, a final insult to the place meant to be escape-proof. For the inmates who remained, the rock seemed less invincible after that night. If 3 men could crawl through its veins and vanish into the fog, What else was possible? The truth, however, remained locked in the shadows. Did Frank Morris and the Anglins drown in the bay, dragged into oblivion by the currents? Or did they survive, vanishing into the underworld, ghosts of a prison that could not hold them? The answer lay not in the headlines, but in a discovery that investigators uncovered weeks later, a discovery hidden in the marshes of Angel Island, where the tide had delivered a torn, half-deflated life raft. Inside it was a wooden paddle, broken in half, and scraps of rubber from the raincoats that Morris and the Anglins had stolen. It was proof that they had at least made it off the rock alive. But what happened after? That was the question that would haunt investigators for decades. And it was only the beginning. Because Alcatraz was never just about one escape. It was a prison filled with stories of betrayal, gang rivalries, brutal punishments, and secrets buried deep in the concrete. And as the authorities dug deeper, chasing rumors and unconfirmed leads, they stumbled onto something far more sinister than 3 missing convicts. Behind the myth of the escape-proof prison, Alcatraz had its own hidden underworld, one that reached beyond its walls, into the gangs and syndicates of America's most dangerous era. And the discovery waiting in Chapter 2 would prove that sometimes the rock held more than just men. It held secrets powerful enough to shake the nation. The morning after the escape, Alcatraz was in a state of siege. Floodlights still swept across the island even as the sun broke over the bay, casting long shadows across the gray stone walls. Guards moved in frantic rhythm, barking orders, slamming doors, pulling inmates from their cells for interrogation. The air was sharp with suspicion. Everyone was a suspect now, every whisper a possible clue, every stare a potential conspiracy. The warden's voice echoed through the corridors, cold and clipped. No one escapes the rock. But the men locked behind bars knew better. The papier-mâché heads had already become legend, whispered from tier to tier like talismans of hope. Some inmates grinned as they heard the guards cursing under their breath. If Morris and the Anglins had even touched the cold surface of the bay before drowning, it meant that Alcatraz could be beaten. Yet the prison officials feared something more than escape. They feared exposure. For Alcatraz, beneath its legend of control, was a nest of rivalries, hidden alliances, and gang secrets that the escape had only brought closer to the surface. Federal investigators combing the cells found more than holes in the walls. They found scraps of metal fashioned into makeshift tools, smuggled items that should never have made it past the guards. Someone on the inside had helped, or at least looked the other way. And in Alcatraz, help never came free. It came at a price, a bargain struck in the underworld currency of gangs. Inside the rock, gangs were everything. They were protection, they were power, they were the only way to carve out control in a place designed to strip it away. And in the early 1960s, those gangs were more ruthless than ever. Among the convicts, the Italian mafia still held sway, though its leaders were aging. Frank "Bumpy" Johnson's contacts whispered through the walls, carrying news from Harlem. West Coast syndicates had roots inside the laundry rooms, where coded messages were stitched into uniforms. Even outlaw motorcycle clubs had connections, smuggling contraband through visiting families. The prison may have been on an island, but its veins ran into the heart of America's criminal world. The escape of Morris and the Anglins forced investigators to ask, which gang had backed them? Which syndicate had something to gain from breaking 3 men out of a fortress in the bay? FBI agents arrived on the island within hours, led by a young, sharp-eyed investigator named Richard "Dick" Wentworth. He was known for his relentless style, a man who saw every contradiction as evidence, every silence as confession. Wentworth believed the escape wasn't just a desperate gamble. He thought it was a signal. The agents interviewed inmates one by one. Some stayed silent, eyes fixed on the floor. Others talked too much, offering rumors about payoffs, secret meetings in the yard, guards who had been bribed with cash or promises. A few whispered the name Mickey Cohen, the Los Angeles mobster who had once run rackets along the coast. Others pointed to the Chicago outfit, still smarting from Al Capone's downfall. And then there were those who mentioned smaller, hungrier gangs, breakaway crews eager to make their mark by pulling off the impossible. Every story raised more questions. But one thread kept resurfacing: the Anglin brothers. Clarence and John Anglin were not ordinary criminals. Yes, they were bank robbers. Yes, they had escaped from state prisons before. But what the FBI uncovered was that the Anglins had ties far beyond their own small-town upbringing. In Florida, they had worked with crews connected to Cuban smuggling networks. In Georgia, they had brushed up against syndicates moving contraband up and down the coast. And once in prison, those ties only deepened. Morris, the genius, had supplied the plan. But the Anglins had supplied something else: connections. Wentworth pressed the guards for answers. How had 4 men managed to gather tools, raincoats, glue, and even hair clippings without detection? How had they hidden their work for months without being reported? The guards insisted they followed procedure, but the files told a different story. Reports had been filed about strange noises in the cells, about blocked vents, about contraband glue found in the workshop. Each report had been buried, ignored, or dismissed. Why? The suspicion spread like wildfire. Someone on the payroll. A guard taking bribes. A staff member smuggling supplies. A deal struck between inmates and the very men sworn to keep them locked down. And that was when Wentworth stumbled upon a document buried in the prison's administrative files, a transfer request from months earlier, written by a guard who had asked to be reassigned off the island. In the request, the guard cited undue pressure from inmates connected to organized crime. His request had been denied. Weeks later, that same guard vanished from duty rolls, marked as resigned without notice. No explanation. No trace. Wentworth's instincts flared. Was this the missing piece? A compromised guard, pressured or bought off, who had looked the other way while 4 men tunneled their way into legend. The Bureau went public with its official line: the men had drowned. The evidence suggested the bay had swallowed them whole. But behind closed doors, agents whispered of gang connections, of favors exchanged, of a possibility too dangerous to admit. If gangs could penetrate Alcatraz, if they could turn guards, if they could smuggle in the tools of escape, then the rock itself was compromised. And it wasn't the first time. Hidden in the archives were reports of gang activity dating back to the prison's earliest days. Al Capone had run his rackets from inside, bribing guards for privileges, running coded messages through laundry slip. Machine Gun Kelly had tried to establish alliances between rival crews, only to be crushed by isolation. Even Robert Stroud, the infamous Birdman of Alcatraz, had allegedly traded information between syndicates. Each case had been hushed up, buried under the myth of the escape-proof island. But Morris and the Anglins had pulled the lid off the secret. Their breakout had exposed not just cracks in the walls, but cracks in the system itself. As Wentworth dug deeper, he began to see a darker picture. The escape was not just about 3 men seeking freedom. It was about gangs testing the limits of federal power. If Alcatraz could be breached, then no prison in America was truly secure. Weeks after the breakout, a report came in from the mainland. A stolen car had been abandoned near the Marin headlands, its tires worn, its seats damp with salt water. No fingerprints, no bodies, no witnesses. Just silence. Yet for Wentworth, it was enough. The men had made it to shore. But where had they gone? Some believed they had been picked up by a boat, arranged by outside accomplices. Others believed they had been ferried across the bay by syndicate contacts, hidden in safe houses before vanishing into the criminal underworld. And some thought they had fled the country altogether, using forged documents and gang networks that stretched as far as South America. For the FBI, the case was a nightmare. Officially, the escape was a failure, a suicide by water. Unofficially, it was an open wound, proof that organized crime could outwit even the harshest of federal fortresses. The prison tightened its rules. Searches became harsher, punishments more severe. Solitary confinement was filled to capacity. But the harder the guards squeezed, the more the inmates whispered. The Rock's reputation was cracking. And then, in late July of 1962, something happened that tore those cracks wide open. A guard on the night shift stumbled into a storage room near the old laundry and found a stash. Knives carved from scrap metal, coded notes hidden in a shoe, and a ledger written in careful hand. The ledger contained names, dates, and dollar amount. At the top of one page was a title that froze investigators in their tracks: The Syndicate. It was evidence that gangs inside Alcatraz had been running an economy of bribes, contraband, and favors, using guards and staff as pawns. The escape, far from being a rogue act of desperation, might have been part of something far larger, a message to Washington that the underworld still had reach, even in the most secure prison in America. Wentworth studied the ledger late into the night, his cigarette smoke curling into the lamplight. The names were coded, but the amounts were real. Thousands of dollars had changed hands. And one entry, written weeks before the escape, simply read, "Payment for freedom." The revelation was explosive. If true, it meant the Rock had been bought and sold under the government's nose. It meant Morris and the Anglins were not just escapees. They were symbols. But before Wentworth could act, before he could bring the evidence to light, the ledger vanished. One morning, it was gone from the evidence locker, replaced with a note scrawled in pencil: "You'll never prove it." It was a message not just to the Bureau, but to the nation. Alcatraz was not impregnable. It was compromised. And somewhere out there, 3 men were either dead at the bottom of the bay or alive under the protection of gangs powerful enough to silence the truth. For Wentworth, the investigation had reached a boiling point. He had lost evidence, lost trust, and lost faith in the system he served. But he had also gained something else: a clue. A whispered name passed in the yard, a name tied to both the Anglins and Morris, a name that pointed beyond the Rock and into the heart of America's criminal network. It was a name that would drag the investigation deeper into danger, deeper into betrayal, and closer to a truth darker than anyone imagined. And it was the cliff's edge where Chapter 2 ends, because the name Wentworth uncovered was one that could ignite a war between the prison walls and the streets outside. Blood in the Bay. The name was whispered in the yard like a curse. Wentworth had heard it once before, buried in reports about West Coast rackets, but here, inside the Rock, it carried weight like a blade pressed against the throat. The name was Salvatore "Sonny" Carbone. Carbone wasn't an inmate. He was a ghost in the system, a fixer for the West Coast Mafia with ties to the Chicago outfit and Cuban smugglers in Miami. His reach extended from the San Francisco docks to Las Vegas casinos, and more importantly, into the veins of federal institutions. Rumors said he had men on payroll inside Alcatraz. Some swore he supplied contraband. Others claimed he used the prison as leverage, keeping dangerous men loyal by promising their families protection on the outside. The ledger that vanished from the evidence locker had contained a coded entry, SC. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to ignite suspicion. Wentworth pressed for answers. He interviewed guards who had resigned suddenly, men who had vanished from duty rosters with no explanation. He followed money trails that led to bank accounts in Nevada and Florida, accounts that ballooned right around the time Morris and the Anglins disappeared. Everywhere he turned, the initials SC lingered like smoke. But the Bureau wasn't listening. Officially, the escape was closed. The men had drowned. The case was a dead end. Washington wanted silence. The Rock was supposed to be invincible, not a playground for organized crime. So Wentworth worked alone. He spent nights combing through inmate letters, coded scribbles hidden in the margins, looking for link. He traced shipments that arrived on the island, from food supplies to construction materials, and noticed irregularities. Crates marked as flour that weighed far too much, shipments signed off by guards who no longer worked at the prison. He suspected smuggling, but proving it was another matter. Then, in August of 1962, proof washed ashore. A fisherman near the Golden Gate Bridge pulled up his net and found a fragment of wood, part of a handmade paddle. Wedged into the splinters was a scrap of cloth, faded and torn. Tests showed it was the same material used in the raincoat raft Morris and the Anglins had built. The evidence had drifted miles from the island, carried by current. But it wasn't the only thing in the net. Mixed with the seaweed was something darker, a leather strap, soaked with salt water, stained with what looked like old blood. And tied to the strap was a tag, stamped with the faint letters, U.S.P.L.C. It was prison property. The discovery shook Wentworth. If the raft had made it this far, the men had likely reached land. But the blood, whose was it? Did one of the escapees not survive? Or had violence already erupted the moment they touched shore? The FBI dismissed it. Speculation, they called it. But Wentworth couldn't shake the feeling. Something had happened after the escape, something darker than drowning. And then came the phone call. Late one night, Wentworth's office line rang. A voice, low and raspy, said only, "Stop digging, or you'll end up in the bay like them." The line went dead. It was the confirmation he didn't want. Someone knew he was close. Someone was watching. Over the next weeks, strange things began to happen. His car was followed by the same black sedan on multiple nights. His apartment door showed marks near the lock, as if someone had tried to force it. Files he left on his desk were disturbed, pages shifted just enough to show they'd been read. In the corner lay Vargas's body. His face was swollen, bruises purpling his skin, his throat wrapped tight with a cord of fishing line. Stuffed in his pocket was another scrap of raincoat rubber. Wentworth knew then that Carbone's network wasn't just covering tracks, it was erasing them. The escape had turned into a killing field. Still, Vargas had left something behind. On the floor, half hidden beneath a plank, Wentworth found a water-damaged logbook. The pages were warped, but one entry stood out. June 11, 1962, pickup, 3 men, Angel Island. Delivery, complete. No names, no details, just proof. The escapees hadn't drowned. They'd been delivered. Wentworth's pulse quickened. It was the first real evidence that Morris and the Anglins had made it to shore alive. But the logbook also confirmed his worst fear. Carbone's hand was in the deal. Delivery complete meant the Mafia had them. He rushed the logbook into safe storage, hiding it in a locker under a false name. He knew it wouldn't stay safe forever, but it was better than the Bureau's files that had already been tampered with. That night, as he drove back toward the city, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it. But the car stayed too close, its beams cutting sharp into his eyes. He turned off into side streets, winding through alleys. The car followed. His chest tightened. He pressed the gas, weaving through traffic, the engine roaring. The sedan behind him surged closer, its bumper kissing his rear fender. Then the first shot rang out, a crack that shattered his back window, spraying glass into the air. Wentworth swerved, tires screeching, the car fishtailing across wet asphalt. He ducked low, heart pounding, and floored it toward the Embarcadero. The bay loomed ahead, black and endless. Another shot split the night, punching through his door. He yanked the wheel, swerved into a warehouse lot, and killed his lights. The sedan tore past, tires screaming. He sat in darkness, chest heaving, the stink of gunpowder and gasoline filling his lungs. He knew then, he wasn't chasing ghosts. The Mafia had declared war. The next day, he went to the only man he trusted, an old colleague named Daniel Harker, a former agent who had quit the bureau after clashing with Washington. Harker was broad-shouldered, with a grizzled face and eyes that had seen too much. He listened in silence as Wentworth laid out the evidence: the ledger, the logbook, the bodies piling up. When Wentworth finished, Harker lit a cigarette, exhaled slow, and said, "You're digging into something the Bureau doesn't want touched. Carbone's got protection higher than you think. If you keep this up, you won't just end up in the bay. You'll be erased." But Wentworth wasn't ready to quit. "If they pulled this off once," he said, "they can do it again. And if Alcatraz is compromised, every prison in the country is." Harker leaned back, studied him. "Then you'd better be ready to fight dirtier than they do." So they formed an alliance. 2 men against a machine. Harker had contacts in the underworld, men who owed him favors. Wentworth had the evidence, the obsession. Together, they began to trace Carbone's network, through gambling dens, warehouses, hidden bars along the dock. They discovered shipments routed through Alcatraz under the guise of food deliveries, crates filled not just with supplies but with contraband, radios, tools, cash. Guards signed off on them, some willingly, others under threat. The prison had become a hub in Carbone's empire. But the most chilling discovery came from a man named Lionel "Red" Dugan, an inmate turned informant. In a whispered meeting during yard time, he confessed that Morris had never drowned, never vanished quietly. "They cut him out," Red said. "He was too smart. Too dangerous. Carbone didn't want him running free. So when they got to shore, they slit him open and left him for the crabs." Wentworth's stomach turned. Was it true? Or was Red feeding him lies? He pressed for proof, but Red shook his head. "Proof don't live long in this world. Men do." 2 weeks later, Red was found in his cell, throat cut from ear to ear. The message was clear. Carbone's reach was endless. Wentworth pushed harder. He cornered guards, threatened exposure, traced money through shell companies. Every step brought him closer, but every step put him deeper in the crosshairs. His apartment was ransacked one night, files scattered, logbook missing. He barely made it out alive when a firebomb shattered his window. And then the betrayal came. It was Harker. The man who had stood beside him, the man he trusted, sold him out. Wentworth learned it too late, in a deserted pier warehouse, where he'd been lured by a tip about a meeting between Carbone's men and an Alcatraz guard. He stepped into the shadows, gun ready, only to feel the barrel of another weapon press against his skull. He turned. It was Harker. His face was blank, his voice cold. "You went too far, Dick. Washington doesn't want this case. Carbone doesn't want this case. And I don't want to die for it." From the darkness, figures emerged. Men in suits, their shoes echoing on the concrete floor. One of them stepped forward, tall, sharp-featured, his hair slicked back. His eyes gleamed like glass under the bare bulb above. Salvatore "Sonny" Carbone. Wentworth's chest clenched. After months of whispers, of shadows, of speculation, here he was. The ghost was real. Carbone smiled thinly. "You've been busy, Agent Wentworth. Too busy. You've been dragging my name through mud, poking where you shouldn't. You should have let the Bay have those boys. But you didn't. And now you'll join them." The men moved closer, their footsteps steady. Wentworth's pulse roared in his ears. He tightened his grip on the pistol hidden in his coat pocket, fingers trembling. He had one chance, maybe less. Carbone raised his hand, signaling the end. The men closed in, shadows swallowing the light. Wentworth drew a sharp breath, every muscle wound tight. And then, a gunshot cracked, shattering the silence. Not his. Not theirs. From somewhere outside the warehouse, another figure entered the scene, unseen but armed, firing into the dark. Bullets ricocheted off steel, men shouted, chaos erupted. Wentworth dove behind a crate as gunfire roared around him, the betrayal exploding into violence. In the confusion, He locked eyes with Harker. For a split second he saw hesitation, doubt, guilt, or maybe just fear. But then Harker raised his weapon again, this time aimed square at Wentworth's chest. The shot rang out, and the world went black. And then, one of his informants, a former dockworker who had hinted at mafia connections to Alcatraz, was found floating near Fisherman's Wharf, his body battered, his mouth stuffed with a scrap of raincoat rubber. The message was unmistakable. The case was no longer about 3 missing convicts. It was about a war. Wentworth began piecing together a theory. The Anglins, with their ties to smuggling crews, had reached out to Carbone's network. Morris, the mastermind, had provided the plan. West, left behind, had been the scapegoat. Together, they had orchestrated an escape with help from the outside, not just for freedom, but as proof that the mafia could breach even the government's most secure prison. The escape was a message: you can't stop us. But what Wentworth feared most was that the message wasn't finished. Whispers spread that other inmates were preparing something bigger. Guards reported coded notes appearing in the laundry again. A kitchen worker claimed he overheard men talking about the next wave. And in the mess hall, someone had carved into the wood of a table, "The rock cracks again." Wentworth tried to raise the alarm, but Washington silenced him. The Bureau couldn't afford another scandal. The public believed the escapees were dead, and the myth of Alcatraz had to hold. So Wentworth took his investigation underground. He met with informants in dimly lit bars, swapped files with detectives willing to risk their careers, and followed rumors into the back alleys of San Francisco. One night, in a Chinatown gambling den, an old smuggler leaned close and whispered, "Your boys didn't drown. They were picked up." Carbone paid the boatman himself. The smuggler slid a photograph across the table. It was grainy, blurred, but it showed 2 men on a dock somewhere in South America, their faces half-shadowed. They looked older, leaner, but Wentworth's blood ran cold. They looked like the Anglin brothers. If the photo was real, it meant the impossible had happened. The men had survived, crossed borders, and vanished into the underworld. But then the smuggler added something else, something that made Wentworth's stomach turn. One of them didn't make it. Morris. He was cut out. The words hit like a gunshot. Had Morris been betrayed by the very men he had saved? The smuggler wouldn't say more. Fear clamped his jaw. But it was enough to shift the investigation. The escape wasn't a tale of unity. It was a tale of betrayal, blood, and power. Weeks later, Wentworth received another blow. His informant inside Alcatraz, a guard willing to speak, was found dead in his car near the Presidio, a single bullet in the back of his head. The police called it robbery. Wentworth knew better. The message was clear: stop digging. But he didn't. He dug until he uncovered a name, a guard still working on the island, one who had been spotted near the utility corridor the night of the escape, one whose bank account had swelled with deposits traced to Nevada. Wentworth prepared to confront him. He set up a meeting in a diner off Market Street, a quiet booth in the back. The guard arrived late, his hands shaking, his eyes darting to every shadow. He slid into the booth, whispered, "You don't know what you're messing with," and reached into his coat. Wentworth froze. But instead of a gun, the guard pulled out a folded piece of paper. He dropped it on the table, his face pale, and whispered, "This is the last thing I'll ever give you." Then he stood, walked out, and vanished into the fog. Wentworth unfolded the paper. It was a list of names, inmates, guards, outsiders. At the top of the list was Carbone. Below it, written in hurried scrawl, were the Anglins. And next to Morris's name, a single word: eliminated. Wentworth's hands trembled as he read it. The truth was darker than he'd imagined. Morris hadn't drowned. He hadn't disappeared. He'd been betrayed. The Rock's most legendary escape was not just an act of defiance. It was a murder plot wrapped in myth. And somewhere out there, The Anglin brothers were alive, living under the shadow of Carbone's protection, while Frank Morris's fate remained a secret buried in the waves. Wentworth knew he was close to unraveling it all. But the closer he got, the more dangerous it became. Because the next morning, as he walked to his car, he noticed something taped to his windshield. It was a scrap of raincoat rubber, torn and stiff with age. Written across it in black ink were 3 words: "Your next Federal." The betrayal. The note on the windshield burned in Wentworth's mind all night. Your next Federal. He stared at it under the yellow lamplight of his apartment, the words written in ink that bled through the rubber scrap. Whoever left it hadn't been sloppy. They wanted him to feel the message, to taste the fear. The raincoat rubber wasn't just a threat, it was a reminder of the escape, of the raft, of Morris and the Anglins. It meant one thing: they were watching. By morning, Wentworth's superiors had grown impatient. Washington called again, their voices sharp, urging him to drop the case. The escape is closed, they barked. The files are sealed. Do not dig further. But Wentworth couldn't stop. Too many bodies had surfaced: informants, guards, dockworkers. Too many clues pointed to a network bigger than the Bureau wanted to admit. So he went silent. Officially, he filed no reports. Unofficially, he worked the streets like a ghost. He swapped his suit for worn jackets, his sedan for borrowed cars. He stopped answering calls at his apartment, stopped eating in the same diners. Every move was shadowed by paranoia. But still, he kept digging. His first lead came from the docks. A longshoreman, known for moving contraband under cover of night, whispered that a boat had been waiting the night of the escape. A small craft, unmarked, with a motor that purred like a sewing machine. It had left Fisherman's Wharf hours before the alarms blared, heading north toward the Marin headlands. Someone had paid the boatman in cash, crisp bills bound in rubber bands. The longshoreman's price for talking was steep, but Wentworth paid. The man gave him a name: Emil Vargas. A fisherman by day, smuggler by night, Vargas was known for running cargo through the currents no one else dared. Wentworth tracked him to a weathered shack near Sausalito, its walls stained with salt, its windows shuttered. When he knocked, there was no answer. The door creaked open, unlocked. Inside, the air was damp with mildew and the stench of rotting fish. A table sat overturned, dishes shattered across the floor. On the wall, someone had scrawled a warning in dripping paint: "Stay out of the bay." In the corner lay Vargas's body. His face was swollen, bruises purpling his skin, his throat wrapped tight with a cord of fishing line. Stuffed in his pocket was another scrap of raincoat rubber. Wentworth knew then that Carbone's network wasn't just covering tracks, it was erasing them. The escape had turned into a killing field. Still, Vargas had left something behind. On the floor, half hidden beneath a plank, Wentworth found a water-damaged logbook. The pages were warped, but one entry stood out: June 11, 1962, pickup, 3 men, Angel Island. Delivery, complete. No names, no details, just proof. The escapees hadn't drowned. They'd been delivered. Wentworth's pulse quickened. It was the first real evidence that Morris and the Anglins had made it to shore alive. But the logbook also confirmed his worst fear: Carbone's hand was in the deal. Delivery complete meant the Mafia had them. He rushed the logbook into safe storage, hiding it in a locker under a false name. He knew it wouldn't stay safe forever, but it was better than the Bureau's files that had already been tampered with. That night, as he drove back toward the city, headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it. But the car stayed too close, its beams cutting sharp into his eyes. He turned off into side streets, winding through alleys. The car followed. His chest tightened. He pressed the gas, weaving through traffic, the engine roaring. The sedan behind him surged closer, its bumper kissing his rear fender. Then the first shot rang out, a crack that shattered his back window, spraying glass into the air. Wentworth swerved, tires screeching, the car fishtailing across wet asphalt. He ducked low, heart pounding, and floored it toward the Embarcadero. The bay loomed ahead, black and endless. Another shot split the night, punching through his door. He yanked the wheel, swerved into a warehouse lot, and killed his lights. The sedan tore past, tires screaming. He sat in darkness, chest heaving, the stink of gunpowder and gasoline filling his lungs. He knew then, he wasn't chasing ghosts. The Mafia had declared war. The next day, he went to the only man he trusted, an old colleague named Daniel Harker, a former agent who had quit the bureau after clashing with Washington. Harker was broad-shouldered, with a grizzled face and eyes that had seen too much. He listened in silence as Wentworth laid out the evidence, the ledger, the logbook, the bodies piling up. When Wentworth finished, Harker lit a cigarette, exhaled slow, and said, "You're digging into something the bureau doesn't want touched. Carbone's got protection higher than you think. If you keep this up, you won't just end up in the bay. You'll be erased." But Wentworth wasn't ready to quit. If they pulled this off once, he said, they can do it again. And if Alcatraz is compromised, every prison in the country is. Harker leaned back, studied him. Then you'd better be ready to fight dirtier than they do. So they formed an alliance. 2 men against a machine. Harker had contacts in the underworld, men who owed him favors. Wentworth had the evidence, the obsession. Together, they began to trace Carbone's network, through gambling dens, warehouses, hidden bars along the dock. They discovered shipments routed through Alcatraz under the guise of food deliveries, crates filled not just with supplies but with contraband, radios, tools, cash. Guards signed off on them, some willingly, others under threat. The prison had become a hub in Carbone's empire. But the most chilling discovery came from a man named Lionel "Red" Dugan, an inmate turned informant. In a whispered meeting during yard time, he confessed that Morris had never drowned, never vanished quietly. "They cut him out," Red said. "He was too smart. Too dangerous. Carbone didn't want him running free. So when they got to shore, they slit him open and left him for the crabs." Wentworth's stomach turned. Was it true? Or was Red feeding him lies? He pressed for proof, but Red shook his head. Proof don't live long in this world. Men do. 2 weeks later, Red was found in his cell, throat cut from ear to ear. The message was clear. Carbone's reach was endless. Wentworth pushed harder. He cornered guards, threatened exposure, traced money through shell companies. Every step brought him closer, but every step put him deeper in the crosshairs. His apartment was ransacked one night, files scattered, logbook missing. He barely made it out alive when a firebomb shattered his window. And then the betrayal came. It was Harker. The man who had stood beside him, the man he trusted, sold him out. Wentworth learned it too late, in a deserted pier warehouse, where he'd been lured by a tip about a meeting between Carbone's men and an Alcatraz guard. He stepped into the shadows, gun ready, only to feel the barrel of another weapon press against his skull. He turned. It was Harker. His face was blank, his voice cold. "You went too far, Dick. Washington doesn't want this case. Carbone doesn't want this case. And I don't want to die for it." From the darkness, figures emerged. Men in suits, their shoes echoing on the concrete floor. One of them stepped forward, tall, sharp-featured, his hair slicked back. His eyes gleamed like glass under the bare bulb above. Salvatore "Sonny" Carbone. Wentworth's chest clenched. After months of whispers, of shadows, of speculation, here he was. The ghost was real. Carbone smiled thinly. "You've been busy, Agent Wentworth. Too busy. You've been dragging my name through mud, poking where you shouldn't. You should have let the Bay have those boys. But you didn't. And now, you'll join them." The men moved closer, their footsteps steady. Wentworth's pulse roared in his ears. He tightened his grip on the pistol hidden in his coat pocket, fingers trembling. He had one chance, maybe less. Carbone raised his hand, signaling the end. The men closed in, shadows swallowing the light. Wentworth drew a sharp breath, every muscle wound tight. And then, a gunshot cracked, shattering the silence. Not his. Not theirs. From somewhere outside the warehouse, another figure entered the scene, unseen but armed, firing into the dark. Bullets ricocheted off steel, men shouted, chaos erupted. Wentworth dove behind a crate as gunfire roared around him, the betrayal exploding into violence. In the confusion, he locked eyes with Harker. For a split second he saw hesitation, doubt, guilt, or maybe just fear. But then Harker raised his weapon again, this time aimed square at Wentworth's chest. The shot rang out, and the world went black. The last secret of the rock. The gunshot tore through the silence like a thunderclap. Wentworth's chest burned, his vision swimming in black and red. He fell backward, the warehouse spinning, the sound of boots and bullets echoing like thunder in his skull. For a moment, he thought it was over, that the bay would claim him, not with water, but with blood. But he was still breathing. The bullet had struck his shoulder, tearing through muscle, but sparing his heart. Pain surged through him like fire, every breath a knife. He clawed toward cover, dragging himself behind a stack of crates as gunfire raged. Shadows flickered under the bare bulb, men shouting, glass shattering. Carbone's men fired into the dark, and whoever had opened fire from outside answered with precision, cutting down one of the suited enforcers with a shot that snapped his head back in a spray of crimson. Wentworth's mind blurred, his hands slick with blood. He pressed the wound, teeth clenched, forcing himself to stay conscious. Through the chaos, he saw Harker, face twisted in panic, torn between Carbone's side and his own conscience. Their eyes met again, and for a heartbeat, Wentworth saw the man he'd once trusted, before betrayal drowned him. Then Carbone's voice rose above the storm. Calm, commanding, chilling. Enough. Take him alive. He belongs to the bay. Two of Carbone's men surged forward, guns drawn. Wentworth raised his pistol with trembling hands, fired wildly. One man dropped, clutching his thigh. The other kept coming. Wentworth braced for the end, but another shot cracked from outside, dropping the second man before he could strike. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and heavy. The intruder finally stepped into the light. It was not a fellow agent. Not an ally from the bureau. It was a woman. She was tall, lean, her coat torn from the chase, her hair tied back. Her eyes burned with the cold fire of vengeance. Wentworth blinked, struggling to place her. Then she spoke, her voice sharp as broken glass. My brothers didn't die in that bay. And I'm here to finish what they started. The words cut through him. Brothers. Anglin's. She was their sister. Martha Anglin. Wentworth had read about her once, buried in old reports. She had visited Clarence and John in state prisons before their transfer to Alcatraz, a quiet figure dismissed by authorities. No one had suspected she was part of their network. No one had suspected she might still be fighting for them. Carbone's face darkened. You shouldn't have come here, girl. Your brothers are gone. Dead men don't need avenging. Martha leveled her pistol at him, steady, unflinching. They're not dead. You used them and you killed Morris. You left them with blood on their hands. But I'll see you burn for it. The warehouse erupted again. Martha opened fire, bullets slicing through crates, sparks flying off steel. Carbone's men scattered, returning fire in a storm of muzzle flashes. Wentworth dragged himself toward the back, teeth clenched against the pain, knowing he couldn't hold out much longer. The air thickened with smoke, with screams, with the sharp stench of gunpowder. Men fell, groaning, bleeding. Carbone barked orders, his voice still calm, still cruel. Martha fought like she'd trained for this moment her whole life, each shot precise, each step forward relentless. But there were too many. Wentworth saw it before she did. One of Carbone's men flanked her, creeping along the shadows with a knife glinting in his fist. Wentworth raised his pistol, his hand trembling, and fired. The shot missed wide, pinging off metal. The enforcer lunged, and Martha spun, driving a bullet straight through his chest. For a moment the tide turned. Carbone himself staggered back, retreating behind his men, fury flashing across his face. Wentworth thought, this is it. This is the end of the Rock's secret. But then Harker moved. His gun rose, his aim fixed not on Carbone, but on Martha. Don't! Wentworth shouted, his voice raw. Harker's eyes wavered. Sweat trickled down his face. His finger hovered over the trigger. And in that hesitation, Martha fired first. The bullet struck Harker square in the chest. He fell, his eyes wide, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. He collapsed beside Wentworth, blood pooling across the floor. The betrayal was finished, but it was hollow, bitter, final. Carbone snarled. You fools think you can touch me? I built this prison. I own this city. You'll both be corpses before dawn. He raised his own weapon, a sleek revolver gleaming in the smoky light. His men flanked him, tightening the circle. Wentworth's vision blurred, his strength fading. Martha stood tall, unflinching, her last rounds chambered, her jaw set. The standoff lasted seconds, but it felt eternal. Then the sound came, a wail that cut through the gunfire like judgment itself. Sirens. Dozens of them, closing fast. Spotlights pierced the warehouse windows, blinding and merciless. The floor shook as federal agents stormed the building, shouting commands, rifles raised. In the chaos, Carbone fired one last shot and vanished into the smoke, slipping through a hidden door like a phantom. His men scattered, some falling, some surrendering. The air filled with gunpowder, with screams, with the heavy boots of justice arriving too late. Wentworth collapsed, blood seeping through his shirt. Hands grabbed him, dragging him into the cold night air, paramedics shouting, lights flashing. He drifted in and out, the world blurring into fragments of sound and light. Martha's voice echoed faintly beside him, steady and resolute. They didn't drown. My brothers live. And I'll never stop until Carbone pays. Weeks later, Wentworth awoke in a hospital bed. The Bureau had buried the story, sanitizing the reports. Officially, Morris and the Anglins had drowned. Officially, the Mafia had no hand in Alcatraz. Officially, Wentworth had been injured in a car accident. But the truth lived in his scars. He had seen the ledger. He had held the logbook. He had watched men die for secrets the government wanted silenced. He knew Carbone's network stretched deep, far deeper than Alcatraz. And he knew the Anglin's fate was not sealed by water, but by betrayal, by blood, by the unseen war between crime and authority. Harker's betrayal haunted him. So did Morris's murder. But most of all, it was the knowledge that Carbone was still out there, a ghost in the system, untouchable, protected. The escape of Alcatraz had not ended on the bay, it had rippled outward, infecting the country with doubt, with corruption, with shadows that stretched far beyond the Rock. In the quiet of his hospital room, Wentworth replayed it all. The papier-mâché heads, the tunnels, the raft, the blood in the bay, the threats on his life, the betrayal, and Martha Anglin's voice, burning with vengeance. Delivery, complete. The words echoed in his mind, a reminder that some crimes never close, some secrets never surface, some mysteries never die. Because the Rock was not escape-proof. It was a stage. And its last secret was not whether men had fled its walls, but how far the darkness of its underworld had spread into the veins of America itself. And as Wentworth closed his eyes, a single thought settled over him like a shadow. If Morris had been eliminated, if the Anglins had lived, then maybe, just maybe, Carbone had already built another rock. One not of stone and steel, but of silence. And no one, not even the law, would ever escape it,